All right, so tonight we have the joy of considering some of humanity's great questions. So what makes us human? What makes us unique as a species in the natural world? What's the secret of our species' success and our ecological dominance? So different scholars over the years, theorists, observers, have suggested various things that might make us special. So language, tool use, religion, morality, war, and many other things have been proposed. Many think the secret of our success lies in our extremely large brains and our abstract thinking, reasoning, and problem solving. Now tonight I'll be suggesting that while any good account needs to be able to explain these things, the secret really lies somewhere else, and this somewhere else is one of the main drivers of our species' genetic evolution over the last few million years. Now let me start with a thought experiment. So imagine we took the brilliant minds in this room and we let you compete against a group of rhesus macaques. And we parachuted all of us into the Ituri forest. So that's the forest in the Congo Basin. And say we drop these rhesus macaques onto an island off the coast of North Carolina. We'd each be going into a novel environment that we haven't evolved to live in. And you can think about, well, who's more likely to win, the monkeys with their relatively small brains or the humans? And this experiment has actually been done many times with groups of lost European and American explorers who have found themselves stranded in environments ranging from the Arctic to tropical forests to the Australian outback and many other places. And what we find is that humans can survive when dropped into these environments. And these are places where hunter-gatherers have survived for centuries, millennia, or longer. We can't do simple things like make the tools we need, find food, locate safe water, make medicines, and build shelters. Meanwhile, the experiments have actually been done with monkeys too, of course, natural experiments. So in one case, a group of a few hundred rhesus macaques had to be evacuated from a colony in Puerto Rico, where they had gotten exposed to some diseases, and they deposited them on an island, an uninhabited island off the coast of North Carolina. So they were faced with the Lost European Explorer challenge. The island is now full of rhesus macaques who did fine. And these are macaques who never had to feed themselves. So they've been provisioned for generations. And so they somehow survived. So how do we do it? Another thing to sort of sharpen your thinking on this is to realize that when you put young children up against apes, so chimpanzees and orangutans, and give them a bunch of cognitive tests, the human children don't actually stand out. They've got these big heads, but it's not clear. It's not helping them solve tool problems more. It's not helping them deal with quantities or spatial other cognitive problems better than the monkeys. What they can really do is copy other people. So they're really good at cultural learning. So I argue that the secret of our species' success is our ability to learn from each other. And this is very subtle because learning from each other requires you to make representations of other minds, and this means the size of the group matters. So humans actually depend on a collective brain where ideas are flowing among many different minds, and over time this gives rise to the process of cumulative cultural evolution. So each generation makes a small few changes to the spear or the way to make a house, or adds a little bit to the store of knowledge about how to process food. They pass it to the next generation, and over many generations, we very quickly get things that no single individual could figure out on their own. So all of our tools and technologies are bequeathed to us through a non-genetic source. And this includes some of our tools for thinking. So things like numbers, elements in language, other kinds of cognitive tools help us solve problems. Many human societies, in fact, probably back over history, counted 1, 2, 3, many. But you've all been bequeathed a counting system that allows you to readily distinguish 35 from 36. Now, this cumulative cultural evolutionary process has formed the major driver in our species' genetic evolution. So you can look at our physiological and anatomical adaptations from head to toe, and you can find things that have been influenced by gene-culture coevolution. One of the best examples is fire. So when we deposited you guys into the Ituri forest, you would have had to make fire. And of course, you know how to make fire, right? Humans have had fire for a few million years. But if you've ever tried to do it, it's really hard unless you have some technology matches or something like that. But despite that, humans have evolved to rely on cooked food. So our small teeth and small stomachs, we have short colons that only make sense as a species that pre-digests its food outside of our bodies. So we let fire and cooking and other kinds of food processing do our digestion for us. That's why our rib cages go straight down instead of splay out like we see in other apes. So we've been shaped physically, anatomically, and I argue psychologically by this gene-culture coevolutionary process. So what are these big brains are for? They're not originally designed for all this reasoning and things that so much emphasis that we place on it. They're originally designed from learning from others. The game became, if you want to learn how to survive, the first thing you have to do is tap into that vast body of knowledge that's stored in the minds of those around you. And then once you get it, you can build on it, maybe do some little bit of reasoning, a little bit of causal model stuff. But anything you come up with on your own is going to be worse than the stuff that's stored out there in the minds of others. And it's very easy to show how once you have a high level of reliance on learning from others, you get things like social norms, you get increasingly complex languages, and other things like institutions that just arise as a product of being able to learn from each other. So this gives us a theory about the source of institutions. So probably the single most important and oldest of human institutions is the kinship system. This is clearly built on aspects of instincts that we share with non-human primates, like our desire to help close relatives, but it's also shaped by culture. And so there's lots of variation around this. Now, I'm interested in what led to the scaling up of human cooperation over time. And one of the things I've argued is that cultural evolution in the last 10,000 years has figured out lots of interesting social technologies. These are kind of like mind hacks. These are tricks to get us to cooperate in increasingly large groups. And one thing that might be of interest, worthy of discussion perhaps, in this group is my colleagues and I have made the case that religions have changed over a few thousand years, and they've gradually been selected through a process of intergroup competition to create the big, powerful moralizing gods that many of us find in today's world modern religions. Using this approach, you can predict what these moralizing gods are going to care about, those things that allow you to expand the sphere. And you get things like supernatural punishment and afterlife. This is the process that entwines morality and supernatural beliefs. Okay. So understanding this is very important for the kinds of things that many of you will want to do. This isn't just an academic exercise. So if you want to get medicine right, you need to think about humans from an evolutionary perspective. So just to give you one simple example, my colleague Dan Lieberman studies running. And it turns out if you just put on the normal shoes they give you, the soft, puffy shoes that many of us use for running, you start to run the wrong way, and then you get plantar fasciitis and all kinds of other problems. You need to think about how humans actually run. One way to do that is to watch little kids. So they run on the balls of their feet. And if you start doing that, then you run in a more evolved style. So there's many examples like that, and we can discuss more of them. But another area is that humans are, all decisions about policy and institutional design have implicit in them assumptions about human nature. So one of the things I've argued, building on the kind of thing I've laid out for you, is that we should be explicit about our theory about human nature and what it is that makes an institution work and what underlies a policy. When you prescribe a policy, you think it's going to do something. So that you're relying on a theory of human nature. So there's many different examples of that we can talk about if people are interested. One that I'm particularly interested in is how you generate innovation. And I point to a lot of evidence where the key to generating innovation is getting large numbers of diverse minds to interact, to create the free flow of information. And that's what we're doing here tonight. All right.
Thanks, Joe. Thanks, Veritas. It's great to be here with Joe and Cullen. I'd like to ask, what about the human mind would be interesting to an objective observer of our minds? Let's say, I always use the term a Martian anthropologist. I know that there are no anthropologists on Mars, at least Martian ones. And what I'm talking about is a cognitive anthropologist. So not interested in what we've done in terms of our impact or what we're able to do, but how we think, what goes on in our minds. What's objectively interesting about that or unusual compared to other organisms? And a lot of things have been proposed. Joe mentioned some of them. Some others are rationality, empathy, a sense of justice or fairness, and then the social learning that has extended so much or become so advanced in the human species to create an emergent property from the population level that we can call culture. And it's true that all of these things are extraordinary in humans, extraordinarily advanced in humans. And there's also a common recognition in our field, I would say, that they represent a quantitative difference from other organisms rather than a qualitative difference or a difference in kind, meaning that other organisms do a little bit of what we do to an extreme degree in all of these respects. But I also like the quote from Alfred North Whitehead, who said, "The distinction between men and animals is in a sense only a difference in degree, but the extent of the degree makes all of the difference. The Rubicon has been crossed." And for you youngsters, that's referring to Caesar coming across the Rubicon in Rome, and that being the point of no return, essentially, attacking his own capital city. And I like to think, instead of crossing Rubicon, I like to think of it as a neuronal action potential. So some of our evolutionary changes of our history are kind of like an action potential where at some lower levels of a stimulus, you see a corresponding increase in the effect. But after some threshold level, you just see an explosion where there's a massive effect, a spike in the effect. And an example that's often used in human evolution is bipedalism. So, and this was an idea that was first shared to me by someone here at Harvard, Andrew Barry, one of the last times I was here speaking. And the idea is that once you are walking only on 2 feet, you have freed up your hands. They no longer have to bear your weight. They can evolve more dexterity and agility, and they're able to do a lot of different things, such as grab your food. And once you are grabbing your food with your forelimbs instead of your face, now you no longer have to have this prognathic structure where your jaw is sticking out and it has all these sort of blunt force sort of muscles governing it. You can have fine motor control of your mouth, which releases essentially selection on the face to do things like have language, which is, of course, enormously important for us. And of course, this didn't happen immediately like an action potential did. It took millions of years. But in some sense, bipedalism freed up our face to be able to make interesting sounds that hopefully we're making tonight. But actually, a lot of people say that bipedalism is unique to humans. It's not. I mean, if you just take a couple steps back and you look at birds who have converged with us on a number of different traits, all birds are bipedal, and they have freed their forelimbs up to do other things too. And they've done something that is just as action potentialist, which is that many birds, most birds, have modified their forelimbs to be able to jet off into the skies, which only 4 different groups of organisms have ever done in the entire history of life that we know of. The insects did it first, then there are, I think, 2 lineages of pterosaurs, and then the birds, and of course, among mammals, the bats have been able to do it. And you might see planes up there, but we did that culturally, but I'm talking about in terms of genetic evolution. And so bipedalism is one of those things where you have this incremental change, and at some point after a threshold, you get a huge effect. And the reason I'm going into that is now I want to go back into our heads. Remember, we're talking about this Martian anthropologist. What is unprecedented about the way that we think compared to all other Earth organisms? What is our highest peak in terms of a spike in the produce of our minds that came about as we gradually increased in our brain size and intelligence? And I would say that it's the big questions that we ask and the answers that we conceive for them. So my first introduction to philosophy was in high school, and a teacher told me that all Western thought was basically descended like grandchildren from these three questions of the so-called Ionian thinkers, they used to call them back in the day. Now they call them the pre-Socratic philosophers. So people before Socrates in Greece. And those three questions were, who am I, why am I here, and where am I going? But, of course, no doubt these questions were asked by people way earlier than those philosophers, and it wasn't a product just of Greece. They're not just Western. Starting with the world's earliest writings, we have evidence to the present day that much of philosophy, literature, art, music has been obsessed, a lot of it, including science, fascinated by these existential, metaphysical big questions, so to speak. So today in the modern world, we still ask these very frequently, such as, how should I and others behave? How ought things really to be in the world? Now, I know on social media, I'm talking about this as asking questions, and mostly on social media, you end up having, oops, I forgot to turn this on, sorry. You can see. Okay. Social media, you often see making pronouncements or declarations much more than you see people asking about these things, right? But I hope that we're at least at some point asking before we declare still. But anyway, even if we're mostly making declarations about these things, it still illustrates the importance of these big questions in our society today. Then we have things like, why does anything exist at all? And how did the universe get here? And even the question that was not showing anymore, but the question that we're dealing with today, which is, why are we the way we are? So our Martian anthropologist, I would say, would want to ask, after looking at all these big questions that are asked by us and nobody else, do any of them have a common thread? Do all of them have a common thread? What's going on here at a deeper level? And I would say that the answer is something like the word ultimacy. They're ultimate questions, in a sense, the things that humans have this fascination for. They're like the concept of infinity. They break our conceptual boundaries. The questions are designed to do that, and we love them precisely because they do that. That's why we like those questions. So think of that action potential again. So after millions of years of our ancestral minds being preoccupied by food, shelter, sex, self-preservation, I mean, we still have all of those things, but now on top of this, at some point, there was an explosion or a spike in our capacity to think and wonder. And it wasn't limited to those basic needs. So now we have those basic needs and desires that we think about, but we love also to ask questions that are at what I would say would be the maximum valence or magnitude that can possibly be conceived. We like to talk about things and think about things that are way too big for us. So consider two of them, which we could sum up as good and God, or our mental and cultural institutions that those things have manifested of morality or ethics, and then religion or spirituality. Now, these two things do have something in common. They are both about ideals, or what you might call like super realities. So the good or the right is about the best possible human being. We have this idea of what the ideal human action or being, or the world that we humans inhabit, the human world. And then God is the ultimate or ideal being, something or someone that transcends everything else. So our Martian anthropologist, in reporting back to the home planet, would basically say that maybe one of, if not the most interesting thing about humans is that we're remarkably idealistic in the sense of being interested in ideals or ultimates. in what could be or should be, rather than just the world that we have present to us. We shoot for the moon. We yearn for, or at least wonder about, something transcendent, something bigger than all of us. And that might be the most wonderful thing about us. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean that anything transcendent or ultimate actually exists, of course, whether goodness or God or anything else. And I don't think that science reveals anything in this realm, or we can even talk about it. But speaking as that Martian anthropologist, which I'm always trying to, it's like my secondary personality, also coincidentally named David Lahti. But I think that yearning, that search for something transcendent makes humans immensely more interesting than if we didn't have that. And perhaps it's makes us the most interesting species on our little planet. Thank you.
All right, so we're going to transition to a little bit of Q&R. And
Thanks.
I'll ask questions for just a few minutes, maybe 20 minutes, and then we'll turn it over to the audience for about 20 minutes or so of questions. So if I could take something away from your talk, David, basically the most interesting thing about humans is the Veritas forum. Because we come here and ask.
Was I pandering too much?
Yeah, I don't know, maybe a little. No, so a question for both of you. Would love to hear what got you into your work. How'd you become interested in using your work as a way for understanding the world?
Do you want to lead? Or?
Well, why don't you do it?
Okay, all right. So my story is, I went to the University of Notre Dame, where I started as an aerospace engineer. In my freshman year, I took a class called Adam's Ancestors. They can offer that kind of class at Notre Dame. And so anyway, it was anthropology. I got super interested in it. Wasn't really bold enough to drop the engineering, so I ended up getting 2 degrees. So I have a BA and a BS, and my BS is aerospace engineering. And at the end of graduate school, I had 2 stacks of applications to study space propulsion or anthropology. And I decided it didn't make sense to send out all these applications. So I just did 2 years of engineering while I thought about it. Ended up going back to school in anthropology, but then I was immediately disappointed because I spent all this time studying. I went to a remote part of the Amazon. I started studying the life ways, and what anthropology had to offer just seemed not helpful. So I started reading all these other fields, and I began building a kind of integrated interdisciplinary approach just to kind of answer the basic questions I had doing field work.
Awesome.
So yeah, I grew up as a nature boy in central Massachusetts, just about 40 miles west of here, and I always knew that I wanted to do something with regard to nature for my job. And my father would always tell me, you can climb trees on the weekends, just be a doctor. And I said, no, I want to climb trees every day. And I ended up studying birds, which allowed me to climb trees every day. So,
and philosophy. So.
Right. So yeah, I climb theoretical trees.
Theoretical trees, that's where I was going.
Theoretical trees on Mars.
Yeah, right. So anyway, but I didn't know that there was any such place that you could go or work that you could do like that. There weren't job openings for people who just, lover of nature, here's $100,000. So I ended up going to college and majoring as a biology major, but it wasn't until I went on a field research course after my sophomore year of college in Michigan, where I saw people who looked like normal middle-aged adults crawling on their hands and knees and running around when they hear a peep from a treetop. And I was like, who are these people? And so I just followed them around, and they were the ones who were teaching us ornithology and entomology and stream ecology, et cetera. And by the end of it, I was just hooked. I didn't know these kind of people existed, right? So at one point, for instance, there was this Professor Joe Sheldon, who I, along with two other of these professors, I dedicated my PhD to many years later. But he was taking us out to show us spring wildflowers. That was the course. And then all of a sudden, he's like 70 years old. He leaps out and grabs, like Mr. Miyagi, if you're too young to know what that is. No, I guess there's a remake. But grabbed a robber fly out of the air with his fingers and showed it to us and said, "What do you think this is?" And we all said, "Bumblebee." And he says, "It's actually a bumblebee mimic. It can bite you, but with its proboscis, just like some flies do, but it doesn't have a stinger." And so then he let it go. It was unharmed. And so the first thing that occurred to me is, okay, this fly has evolved to look like a bumblebee to fool its predators, and yet this human being knows better than the predators what this really is. So I asked him, like, what do you do for a living? What is this? So I ended up just wanting to be like him. So that's why I'm here today. And then very briefly, the philosophy part of it was when I was an undergrad, I also was a huge fan of J.R.R. Tolkien. I wanted to go to Oxford on for my junior year abroad. But as a biology major, there's no reason to do that. They didn't offer any courses in this program. It was all history, so I was like, okay, medieval history, go over there, study medieval history. And then I got a call from my advisor who said, you need to take a philosophy course. You haven't taken a philosophy course, and it's not going to be offered in senior year when you come back. You need to do it over there. Took a philosophy course, ended up being about whether we're a part of nature or apart from nature. And I said, that's what I want to do too. So it was two separate things, but I love them both, and so I'm still sort of hooked by both of those ideas today.
That's great. I'm going to improvise a little bit, but based on both of your answers, it is really striking to me that you're both working in, multiple fields, right? Like you have two PhDs, which is ridiculous in and of itself. And I mean, you're an engineer and doing, I don't know, you both have a broad array of experiences. I wonder how does that shape how you ask those three questions that David mentioned? How you answer them, how you ask and answer them, having these multiple lenses with which to look at the world. It seems like it adds a bit of richness. I don't know if I'm injecting something there myself, but it seems like maybe it's almost necessary to have these different perspectives to ask those bigger questions.
Yeah, I mean, in my experience, one of the things about, so I've been a professor of cultural anthropology, of economics, of psychology, and now human evolutionary biology. And all of those different disciplines ask different questions, they use different methods and stuff, and you realize disciplines are just cultural traditions. So, I went into all this, I was already an anthropologist, right? So I'm like, oh, I just got to learn the language of this group. But then you get to see the world through how they see it, and you see, well, okay, they look at it in different ways, and then actually you can kind of, in a sense, rise above it and use tools and kind of mix and match to tackle the questions you want to tackle.
Yeah, similarly, my kids, once when they were trying to tell their friends at school what I do, they would go around the class and everybody would say, what does your mother do? What does your father do? Whatever, what do your caregivers do? And my kids could never answer the question because every time they heard somebody say what I do, there was like a different word used. It was either professor or scientist or psychologist or biologist. Some of these things are just at different levels of explanation, but others are just these cultural traditions that Joe was mentioning. And if I study behavior and there is a human element to it, it will automatically be simultaneously biology, psychology, and anthropology. And if there's any kind of theorizing or hypothesizing going on, that top part of the scientific method where you're coming up with new ideas based on what has been done before, then it's going to be philosophy as well. So, I mean, we're both in these multiple fields, not because we're dilettante, or is that the word, or dabbling, or or whatever. It's because the things that we're interested in are at the nexus of different traditional fields. I mean, I can't speak for Joe, but in Joe's writing, I can say at the very least that you can see all of those fields represented, even though the paper itself or the book itself looks like a unified whole. And since that's the case, it should raise red flags that maybe our disciplines are a little too confining, in that we should be looking at what we want to study regardless of those traditional disciplines. And then if people label these disciplines, or we get accepted for a job in a particular department, that's, whatever.
I think we should get rid of them. But
Get rid of departments?
well, we certainly don't need the social sciences carved up into 15 different bins, right? I mean, you ask a question about why humans cooperate, that cross-cuts a whole bunch of them.
Yep. Agreed. So, question for you, Joe. Can you talk about how church policies related to marriage and family have led to the evolution of weird cultures?
Okay. Well, I need to give the audience background. So the first part of the background is I was interested in this question of psychological variation around the world. So as we heard in the introduction, Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic is this acronym that my colleagues and I developed to refer to the subjects most commonly studied by economists, behavioral economists, psychologists, and others. And we found that there's a great deal of psychological variation. We and others found that there's this psychological variation around the world. So then I spent from basically 2010 to 2020 trying to develop ideas that would at least explain some of this variation. And one of the strange ideas I got, and this starts from an anthropologist named Jack Goody, who I had read in graduate school. And I basically took that idea and then took a bunch of tools from economics and tried to make it into something respectable. And the idea is that kinship in Europe is very strange early on. Like in medieval Europe, it's already unusual in the sense that there are lots of monogamous nuclear families. There's no clans, there's very little cousin marriage, it's little arranged marriage. And so the question was, why is that the case? Jack Goody had argued that it was due to the church. So, and then I was also wondering how institutions affect psychology. So in the book, I make the case that the Roman Catholic Church, one branch of Christianity, had a set of taboos and policies related to marriage and the family that systematically broke down Europe's tribes into monogamous nuclear families, and in the process dissolved the tribes, because the marriage rules required you to marry other Christians who were not related to you, which would have dissolved the tribes. And then that kinship formations have a big effect on people's psychology. So in the paper that this question comes from, we spend a lot of time trying to connect the diffusion of the church through Europe to this differences in kinship systems to contemporary psychology. And you can explain a remarkable amount of global psychology by just knowing things about the family structure. And then within Europe, you can explain differences among Southern Italians and Northern Italians, for example, by knowing the details of their history and when the church did what where.
Can I respond to that a little bit?
Please do.
Yeah, so my perspective on this, and I'd be interested to hear what you say about this, is that the Catholic Church is too simultaneously too late and too early to be the whole explanation anyway. Too early because we have things going on like the sweep of Protestantism across Europe starting in the 16th century, which sometimes was as much of a hegemony as Catholicism was, but sometimes was not. Like the Puritans, I mean let's say the Quakers in Pennsylvania they didn't recognize extended kin groups. You might say, well, they already came out of that Catholic tradition before the Reformation happened. But then we've got the issue of 500 years later, nothing has bounced back. That we had something that happened during the Middle Ages, and then it didn't, and then it just disappeared, never to return again, even after we removed the hegemony. But more importantly, is that I would say that the kernel of what you're saying, which I really appreciate, this idea that under Roman Catholicism or under Christianity, say as a system, we have a switch of sorts from a kin-based morality, where you love the people who are closest to you, and that's pretty much it. And it tends to be associated, as you agree in your work, with antipathy towards outsiders. Switch from that old model to a new model, which I think you call impersonal morality, but I wouldn't want to call it that because I think it's very personal. It's very relational. It's just that anyone is potentially your neighbor, not only those who are related to you. But I don't think that started with Catholicism. I think that started with Jesus' moral reform, and there were other currents that were going along at the time in the Hebrew mind and in the rabbinic tradition later.
Right. Well, we don't make this a debate about weird people, but so the obvious way to address your last concern is the question of whether it's the Roman Catholic Church or all the other brands of Christianity. So what we do is we did an analysis of the time you were actually under the Roman Catholic Church versus like the Orthodox Church. We got Coptic Christianity, we got Syriac Christianity. There's tons of Christianities, right? The Roman Catholic Church is the big successful one because that's the one the Europeans carried around the world as they conquered all these other places, right? So that suggests that, and it's what we see when we analyze the Orthodox groups, is that they have a kind of light effect. So the Orthodox Church is implementing this marriage and family program, but they do it later, not as seriously. So you get a light effect in what's there, and you don't see it like the Coptic Christians were still marrying their cousins way late, and so you don't see any effects there. The question of Protestantism, really one of the things I wanted to tackle was Weber's famous question, which is he wanted to put all this emphasis on Protestantism. I needed to explain how you even get a religion that is so individualistic. Protestantism is hyper-individualistic, so much so that your mental states matter a lot. Like by faith alone was the idea you get to heaven just by belief alone. That's very strange in the context of world religions. The idea that each person gets to read the Holy Script for themselves. Nobody else, that's the job of the elders and the specialists and stuff like that. So there was very individualistic religion. And so if you look at the places where the church had its biggest influence, you'll often get strong Protestantism there. They dropped the taboos. So you see this resurgence of cousin marriage and stuff, but then secular authorities begin implementing these bans and stuff like that. So you see this when the U.S. gets colonized. Certain groups in the U.S., as they're expanding, Europeans are expanding across the continent, they start to readopt cousin marriage, and then state laws come in and impose them. And there's this great paper by Goshen colleagues, economists, and they show that when the state bans come in, you get greater economic prosperity in the future for those groups. So there is this kind of push and pull that goes on afterwards. So one of the things about the theory is that people always try to make it entirely about this one church thing. But I see that as the pebble. I actually use that metaphor. The pebble that led to the avalanche of the details of Western society.
Yeah, so I would say that the pebble was far earlier. When you have a moral reformer like Jesus saying things like, who are my mother and brothers, and it's anyone who listens to me and follows my commandments, you have right there the seed of what you're talking about already. You have basically no longer are you supposed to be looking at somebody in terms of how close they're related are to you. This is already the seed for the destruction of kin groups as being the be-all and end-all, right?
But you see that in other world religions too. So
I'm not even talking about other world religions. I'm just talking about within the scope of the area that you were looking at. So, yeah.
Okay. Well, just remember, my target is weird psychology. I'm trying to explain.
Right, of course, you're right. But I would suggest maybe, well, we can talk about this some other time, but I would suggest maybe that those places where you see that mentality being grabbed more tightly, and the kin groups dissolving, and people being less likely to be holding antipathy to those outside of their kin groups, are the places where that moral reform was taken more seriously. And so you could imagine that it's exposure to the church, but you could also imagine that it's exposure to, or it's just commitment. If there are certain areas of Europe, presumably, where these ideas were disseminated more faithfully, were held more tightly, were embraced by people who realized, I don't mind if you marry somebody from a couple counties over or something like that. But I don't know.
Okay.
But I enjoy the work, though. Love the paper, and look forward to talking to you.
Well, I mean, we're talking about religion, but one of the things that I bring up is that a lot of world religions develop moral universalism. So the notion that our rules should be everyone's rules, which is not something you see in lots of anthropologically known communities. It's like, we have our law, those guys have a different law, and we don't have to do that. So this idea of moral universalism comes in, and also free will. So these ideas are circulating in Eurasia at this point.
Yeah. I particularly like the idea of moral universalism because it generates predictions from an anthropological perspective. I would suggest that any small-scale society would probably not have explicitly universalizing morality that includes everyone. I mean, this is the reason why a lot of small-scale societies named for themselves are just people,
Right.
or something
Meaning
like
that
that.
those other guys are not
Are not people, right? Exactly. And I'm not trying to dehumanize any group of people who
That's
might be
actually, unfortunately,
dehumanizing.
that is humanizing them, because
Yes,
that's
right,
the standard
exactly.
model.
Yes,
right?
that is exact. Whereas I would predict that we should see universalizing morality and universalizing religion the more interaction societies have with each other.
Yep.
So just to use the Judeo-Christian example again, at the time when that moral reform happened that said it doesn't matter how close you are related to each other, all it matters is anyone can be your neighbor. That was at a time when there were more non-Jews than Jews in Jerusalem. And Herod, who was related to them, had sold himself out to the ruling powers. And the person that you might buy bread from down the street could be somebody who had come from Africa or Saudi Arabia or anywhere else. And so it totally made sense that morality and religion would universalize in that kind of environment rather than, say, in a small-scale society where people are not interacting with people from other places. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, we actually have a project on that.
Oh, great.
So I have this idea that the Silk Road plays a very important role. So we're looking at, we have this database of religious history, and we're looking at the emergence of moral universalism. And I think that proximity to markets will be related to more likelihood of developing universalism. Because you need to exchange with strangers, and it's mutually beneficial.
Great.
But I don't know the answer yet. That could be wrong.
Yeah, cool.
So I'm going to ask another question that wasn't on the list, but the things that come to my mind is, not being in these areas explicitly. Was this good for the world? Like, how would we evaluate if was it good? I mean, I know we spent a lot of time discussing what happened and
Right.
what it is, but I think we also want to understand, what should we do, which requires going back and making a judgment.
Right.
So,
That would be
can we make a judgment?
philosopher.
You mean the breakdown of kinship groups, or what are we talking about? What's it in terms of what was good?
I mean, we could say maybe we'll take that. We'll take the policies of the church, the breakdown of kinship groups.
okay.
Well, then you should answer that. I mean,
So, I mean, I addressed this in the book, which, so this altered society in a way that favored things like individual rights, universal human rights. It also led to massive colonialism, genocide with the European expansion, slavery, but then it also led to vaccines, airplanes, clean water, and a much larger human population. So, I mean, it all depends on how you want to weigh things out. It's not a math problem I could easily sum up, right?
yeah, I hesitate to say anything, but I would say that overall, I believe that a morality based on principle is superior to a morality based on kin. And I don't mean that mothers shouldn't take care of their babies, grandmothering, grandfathering, fathering, siblings getting along together. All these things are extremely important. We don't want to get rid of human nature in that respect, but principle can elevate human nature, can liberate us essentially from shackles of only loving your kin. I just don't think that only loving your kin is sustainable. I don't think that's the way that we ought to be, just from an evaluative perspective. I don't think that any sibling should lie to get their brother off the hook for something illegal that they did, to use one example that you use. I can understand the person for doing that, lying under oath, to get their brother off the hook. but I don't think that we ought to do it. I would want to wish, and I would hope that everybody would wish that the brother hadn't done it, even though it will be painful to them and the family to do that. I think a morality based on principle is superior to one based on kin.
Yeah, I mean, that almost makes me think like, who is your brother? As you were talking about earlier, if we're all brothers and sisters, is there a priority because we, share a familiar relationship? Does that take precedent over the rest of humanity?
And I think we have to take, when we talk about all brothers and sisters, there are some groups that do use those terms for each other, and other groups that don't. So I would say the more individualistic a culture is, the less likely they are to call somebody who's not related to them, or a senior person not related to them, mother or father. Less likely they are to refer to their generational peers as brother and sister, and less likely they are to take care intuitively of their, or immediately, implicitly of their unrelated offspring. That's kind of an unfortunate situation, but it's a product, a natural product. I don't think it's moral to abandon this idea of brothers and sisters, but I think it naturally happens when we have high group stability. So when you see us, I would hope that even when we have high group stability, we would do that and see each other as brothers and sisters. But who are the people who really do end up using those terms? They're usually the people whose groups are unstable, who are and are threatened, and do not have, who are the underdogs in the power structure. That's like I was mentioning the Society of Friends, the Quakers. They call themselves brother and sister. African American groups have called each other brother and sister, and I would say for the exact same reason, that in a situation of group instability, you tend to use these fictive kin terms because it takes this aspect of human nature, kinship, brings it back, and allows the group to be more cohesive in a time of instability or a time of oppression or lack of power.
One thing, I'm very reluctant to chime in on these normative things because a lot of them depend on these culturally transmitted preferences. So, I kind of like the idea of human rights, but I know as an anthropologist, I just like that because it fits my way of thinking, individualistic, disposition-oriented, moral universalism and whatnot. If I had grown up somewhere else, I wouldn't think that. But one thing I think that this kind of science can do is it can help us analyze things. So one thing that I've spent time analyzing is there's this question about whether, so right now we have laws that prevent people from taking more than one spouse at a time. So laws against polygamy. And there's a question that's now circulating amongst lots of societies as to whether it makes sense to have laws that require people to only have one wife. And in my work, I've made the case that that practice spread, and it spreads with Christianity, but it has a stabilizing effect to the society. And you need evolution to get to this logic, but the logic is that left to their own devices, in many societies, well, 85% of human societies allow elite and high-status men to take additional wives. So in so many societies, what you see is the wealthiest and highest status men take additional wives, and that leaves this pool of low-status unmarried men who have little or no prospects in the mating and marriage market. And those guys get into crime. They have low temporal discounting, so they take a lot of risks. They go, they're useful in wars because they can be exploited to do raiding and things like that. So monogamous marriage essentially, sorry about the economics terminology, but it redistributes potential wives across and it enlists more fathers. So a monogamous society has a higher percentage of its males enlisted as fathers and husbands. We know that in monogamous societies, men's testosterone goes down when they get married. It goes down again after they have children. In polygynous societies, it doesn't go down at all. There's no low T in polygynous societies. It just stays up there. So that's actually cultural endocrinology. And anyway, so this looks like a cultural technology that you don't find it in hunter-gatherer societies. They have polygyny. The good hunters and the shamans and stuff have multiple wives. So this is a cultural technology to create a more stable society. Now, you might say, well, we believe in freedom of religion. There's Mormons who want to have additional wives. We believe in freedom of association. Consenting adults should do what they want. That's fine. That's a perfectly good argument. But in weighing the costs and benefits, you need to know the analysis. What are the costs I should expect here if I allow this social dynamic to unfold? And we've seen it unfold. So when the Mormons started doing polygyny, we see exactly the dynamics you see in Papua New Guinea. In fundamentalist Mormon communities today in various places, same dynamics. There's lost boys, which are cast off into the larger society.
On that note, would love to open it up to audience questions. So I have, okay, great, they're right there. So let's go. I think I saw you in the back first. So if you could project your question, I'll replay it so that the recording can hear it.
I just was curious about. I just was thinking about this sort of recently, and it was relevant to things you guys were discussing about how I was totally wrong. So please feel free to say, everything you just said is wrong. But I've heard that in sort of Viking cultures, they were sort of very highly individualistic, and there was sort of a proto-capitalism, and especially just Iceland, where the influence of the king was kind of low, and also there was a very high influence on you just living an independent dranger guy, it's sort of less important about the community, sort of be the hero sort of thing, sort of the hyper individuals kind of morals. And then also, actually, they were very open to guests, because guest laws were really important. Sort of there's a social home that someone came, you have to feed them and house them. Maybe they weren't a relative, and they weren't a Norse person. Any person came by, there was sort of a need to do this. And this sort of seems like some of these sort of weird morals, but obviously these people were not Christian at all. They were, it was pagan, and they were very late to Christianize even. And later in the Viking period, they do Christianize. But
you want to come up here?
Yeah, no. So, I think I hear the question. If I'll try to repeat it for the recording. Effectively, if I heard what you're saying, so there's some maybe aspects of the Vikings and their culture that might look like what you've described as weird, but this is, there was no influence of the church, and this was, many, hundreds of years ago. So, I don't know if you're familiar with these cultures.
So societies vary a great deal in the intensity of their kinship structure. The extreme would be societies have clans and paddy rice agriculture. So the Vikings look much more like societies you find in New Guinea, for example. So anthropologists have called them big man societies. And these are cases where there is a spectrum for people to be entrepreneurial, and they use their success and whatnot to build a coterie of dependent followers, and then they can go on raids, or they can use it for economic purposes. This is often associated with big gift giving. So you accumulate a lot of stuff, you have a big party, and then you get a lot of people interested because you give out stuff. And then they all think you're cool because you gave away all this stuff, and that increases your power and stuff. And then men compete over this. So you might not have a clear leader until someone sort of rises above the crowd. You just have a lot of people competing. Famously, in some New Guinea societies, these groups have true money. And a lot of people thought that there was no true money until states, but they, at least by many anthropological descriptions, it looks like they were exchanging and buying and selling and trading with true money.
All right, so I think I saw here, we'll go here, there.
Awesome. Thank you for talking. I really, I think both of y'all, to differing extents, agree that religion has played a pretty big part in shaping, I guess, the ethics and the sort of social structure up to this point. And my question is, and this is slightly vague / open-ended, so please, I apologize in advance. Given that society is moving pretty rapidly towards becoming the most secular society, please correct me if I'm wrong, I think the secularization of society is pretty rapid at this point. I'm wondering what you guys see religion having a role in, given that people are sort of moving away from religion and sort of becoming more secular in certain aspects. Obviously, people, still are religious. It's just that, at least in society, it's less reflected, I think. So I just wanted to hear that.
Yeah, so briefly, I'll just repeat it further. So if I make sure I understood it correctly, the question is, we talked a lot about religion and the impact of religion on society, but our modern world seems to be becoming more secular. And so what is the impact of that, and what is the role of religion maybe moving forward?
Yeah. Let's step back a little bit and talk about where these moral rules came from. I would say that our tendency to cooperate in the ways that we do and the kinds of norms that we have now would have predated religion. We were cooperating in these kinds of ways before we were conceiving of gods or anything particularly supernatural, with the possible exception of animistic powers and those kinds of things. I would say that it even predates that, because we do have other organisms that cooperate in ways that sort of presage a little bit or have a lot of the features that we see in our morality today. What we don't see until we get modern humans, very modern humans that are capable of language and writing and these things, is the imbuing of those norms with what I talked about is that this deeper element, this ultimacy, this transcendence. So we don't just think, I can't kill this individual. Now we say that killing this individual is evil. In and of itself, it's something that the creator of the universe disparages. And so the question then, with that background, what's going to happen when you remove God from the picture? And there are a broad variety of answers to that question from different people who know exactly what they're talking about. So I don't know where we are the same or differ on that, but my perspective is that the features that are closest to universal human nature, if you will, and murder is one of those, will survive. But the ones that are specific to, I mentioned Jesus' moral reform, ones that are specific to moral reforms that have happened in history may not survive. And I would say that the reason why humanism has some cachet today, even in those areas of fundamental equality of all human beings, for instance, which is not, Darwin mentioned, it has no precedence in other animals. This is something that we have to inculcate into our children or it will be lost, and that's a bad place to be. I think that there is a generational shift that can happen in that kind of situation where the humanists now are culturally, say, Christian in this country, a lot of them. And so they will believe in equal human rights that came out of John Locke and other people in Enlightenment Europe who had a Christian background, even if they weren't explicitly Christian themselves. John Locke was. But I don't think we can promise ourselves that equal rights for all or equal responsibility to treat everyone as endowed by the Creator with fundamental rights if the Creator doesn't exist.
So, yeah, I've spent a lot of time working on this, and we've compiled quite a bit of evidence that having certain kinds of supernatural beliefs, so believing God will punish you, rewarding doesn't matter, that He's monitoring you all the time actually does lead people to be more pro-social. So I do think that there's a serious question as to whether there'll be a decrease in fabric. And I'm not worried about whether people will say they believe in human rights. I'm worried about whether they'll pay their taxes and cheat and engage in corruption and hire their friend instead of the best person. All these little things that corrode the social network, whether they'll lie in court to save a friend instead of telling the truth to an impersonal institution. So I think that's where things, you swear an oath on the Bible, if you don't believe in God, it doesn't mean anything, right? It's just, okay, now I can lie. So that's a concern. I think it's a serious concern. Now, when people want to counter that, they say, well, what about Denmark, right? So Scandinavia, the various countries in Europe, there's very little serious religious belief. I mean, there's some interesting spiritual stuff, but and it seems to function great. Okay, but maybe does it then work in a place that's diverse? That remains to be seen, I think.
Just to add one thing to that, since you mentioned Denmark, I would say that there's a generational decay that we might hypothesize here, where let's say generation one generation one believes in God and holds the morality that comes from that particular religion. Generation two has abandoned God, but still is hanging around with generation one. All those elders are still there and are influencing them, and so they still have the morality even though they don't have the metaphysics to support it. Generation three, or maybe four, depending on how long-lived you are, no longer actually has somebody in their family or in their community that actually believes in the metaphysical thing that underlay the morality. Now you're in a position where you can say, you let it go.
Oh, one fun, or I think it's fun, it's interesting, note on the religion thing. It is true, so it's especially noticeable that the US has had a decline in religious belief recently. So that might be shaping your thinking. Europe, of course, has been low for a while. But last time I checked on the data, religious belief is holding steady at a global level because religious people have more babies. So it's a straight, it's good old natural selection, back to evolution.
All right, there were a couple other questions. I think you had, yeah.
So I have more of a technical question and hypothetical question. You were talking about pre-Socratic area, which Karl Popper says is the best area in all this Greek philosophy. What do you think that caused the drawback between Thales and Anaximandros and then Pythagorean, Plato, and Socrates, this decay in terms of like scientific thinking? Because especially Anaximandros, he tries to explain nature by Apeiron, and he lays the first foundation of evolution of all these three big questions that you were saying. But then, with Pythagorean and then Plato, lately Socrates, we see a decay in this empirical thinking and based on proof thinking. So what do you think was the breakdown? Because they were all in Greek colonies, same culture, same type of activities, except Pythagorean left to Sicily, but still the same.
Should I
I'm going to ask you to replay that one.
So the idea, so the question related to why did all these pre-Socratic philosophers, and then actually even Plato and later philosophers, have this break where there was less productivity? I wouldn't necessarily say that it's less productivity, but that there's some kind of break between in roughly 5th, 6th century BC in Greek philosophy. Now, this is getting kind of a little bit off topic, but really briefly, I would say that Greek philosophy has always had three elements to it. There is the empiricist, the rationalist, and then what you might call an interest in ecstatic, or so more sort of mystical or even religious sort of philosophy. Some philosophers have multiple aspects of this. I would say that when you have empiricism, as you did in the pre-Socratics, but you don't have monotheism or monism, there's only so far than that can go, because there's insufficient metaphysical support for the idea that your conclusions will be the same everywhere in the universe. If you still believe that Ceres or Demeter is in charge of the grain, you can't have a scientific agriculture. So what replaces that is the Platonic idea of a rational world, where you have the gods are not really important anymore, and they can fight all they want. Maybe they don't even exist, but we have a reasoned basis for the universe, which is a sort of monism. And in Plato, it's a quasi or proto-theistic monism. Sometimes he uses the singular when he talks about God, and sometimes he uses the plural. But anyway, that's what I would say about that.
I don't know which one of you starts. We go laptop and then.
Okay, the laptop for my notes for the question. So I see another possible grounding for morality that we are discussing: storytelling. So I'd like to ask you both about the role of storytelling in human affairs as opposed to a belief in an ultimate value. And here I'm going to introduce the ideas of Yuval Noah Harari, coming from his book 21 Lessons for the 21st Century. And I think this also connects to the prior question on the pre-Socratics. So Harari writes, quote, and referring to these kind of questions, quote, "What kind of an answer do people expect? In almost all cases, when people ask about the meaning of life, they expect to be told a story. Homo sapiens is a storytelling animal that thinks in stories rather than in numbers or graphs, and believes that the universe itself works like a story, replete with heroes and villains, conflicts and resolutions, climaxes and happy endings." End quote. So for both of you, where do you see the role of storytelling in human development, evolutionary psychology, and cultural evolution? For Professor David Lowey, do you see a difference between storytelling and ultimacy? And perhaps you can also address emotivism, which might answer this question, which is the belief for the audience, I'm sure you're both familiar with it, that rather than morality being grounded in general rational beliefs, it's actually just our emotional response to the situations we're in, which would connect quite well with storytelling as the basis of our moral beliefs.
Well, certainly storytelling is widespread in the anthropological record. Stories contain lots of different kinds of information. They often contain moral information, but sometimes they contain ecological information. So you can think of them as a kind of social technology for storing things and make us easy for recall. There are some societies that don't have much in the way of stories, so it's not an easy, clear human universal like status. Yeah, so I think that most morals was kind of a, people communicated moral behavior by telling stories, not by giving people a list of principles to follow.
So in relation to the question about relating storytelling to ultimacy, I would say, we don't even have to get to ultimacy. Let's just say truth and usefulness. Take a pragmatic morality. It has no metaphysics at all. It's just proof is in the pudding. If the story works, then it becomes part of your morality. If it doesn't, then it doesn't become part of your morality. But notice, there is something else, not the story, that is the judge by which the story will either be excluded or included. So stories are like tools. You have a stick and you have a hammer. And try to use the stick as a hammer is not going to work as well as a hammer. Those are like two different stories. You end up tossing the stick and using the hammer. So it's not fundamentally about stories. It's fundamentally about the truth that underlies the distinction between a useful story and an unuseful story, I would say. And that's not even referring to metaphysics at all or ultimacy.
All right, we'll take just a couple more questions. So we'll do there, and I haven't gotten anyone over here, so we'll do there and someone over here. We're going to prioritize students also, just for time's sake, but right there. Yeah.
So there's been some interesting data in the past couple of years showing how around 80% of converts to the Eastern Orthodox Church here in America is men. And then also there's some interesting research that came out this year how there's actually an increase in religiosity in Finland, and that the people who praise God or some deity has actually risen. It's risen more among men. And then we can also look at the history of religion, in the Gospel of Thomas in the first century, we have Jesus talking about in order for a woman to be saved, she has to be a man. And then we also have this discourse in even Jainism and Buddhism, how for a woman to be saved, they have to become a man and everything like that. And so I guess so we have some historical and also present evidence to suggest that men are very much interested and drive this interest in religion. So I just wonder then, is there some sort of evolutionary, psychological connection between men and religion that kind of predisposes them, it seems, to want to be religious or be interested in those times?
Well, so
maybe just maybe you could repeat it.
well, so I guess the question was, is there something about men that makes them interested in religion from an evolutionary point of view? And the way I've had to engage this question, actually, so I ran a big cross-cultural project where we collected data from lots of different societies around the world. And we wanted to address this question, which the sociologists have put. If you do surveys in the US or anywhere else, you'll find that women report more belief in God and more religiosity. And then psychologists studying that have shown that they can erase the entire difference between men and women by controlling for their mentalizing, by looking at their tendency and ability to represent other minds. So women are particularly good at that. That's, we find a sex difference everywhere we've looked. Women are moms, that's not too surprising. But when we analyzed this across lots of small-scale societies, we found a mixed bag. So we found some societies where men were more religious and some where women were religious. When the men were more religious, it tended to be more ritual-oriented. There was a lot of activities and actions that had to be accomplished in order to basically make deals with supernatural agents.
We're just going to take one. I think there was someone over here.
Question we're going to get back to later.
Or where? Sure.
Okay, thanks. One thing I wanted to say actually earlier is that religion's actually on the rise globally. I was just checking this morning, but particularly Islam, and Christianity to a slower degree. So it's not just holding steady. Just predominantly, I think, in our kind of Western culture, we just constantly are hearing how secularism is on the rise. I'm really curious about the implications of the shift away from religion in the context of marriage and the nuclear family in America, which I know that we touched upon a bit before. It seems like both of you agree that this has been kind of stabilizing factors across centuries, and the conversation reminded me of an article I read a few months ago that I dug up about where a sociologist from the University of Virginia was arguing about how fixing a lot of like America's broken social fabric has to start with both renewing marriage and family life, especially in poor and working class communities where the fabric of family life is weakest. And I know that you are not policymakers or whatever, but I was really curious, especially since you have such rich interdisciplinary backgrounds, if maybe you could give the perspective or opinion about how these type of stabilizing factors have kind of risen and fallen, and if you were going to venture out into having policy suggestions, one thing that came to mind was like the policy that Mitt Romney was advocating for, to have like a financial support basically for families early on. Like what sort of your mentality around that would be, and if you, okay, that's a good question.
So maybe try to repeat it and then.
Well, it sounded like
What do we say the crux of it is the impact of what policies they might think about in terms of like having a stabilizing effect on families and culture and.
Yes, I'm basically curious that within like the kind of historical sociological backgrounds that you've come from, like how like any policy recommendations, I guess, or sort of how you predict things will move going forward.
Right. Well, my only thoughts on this are what I think that we're seeing in, so the US is particularly individualistic, but of course, lots of European countries, England, places like that, are quite individualistic and been getting more individualistic over the century. And this goes along with the percentages of people living alone, the actually breakdown of the nuclear family. So Christianity broke down these complex kinships into the nuclear family. This led to a lot of individualism, but then individualism, the culmination is we're just individuals, we're not families anymore, right? So if you follow it through to its logical conclusion. So I think we're just seeing that progress. I don't have any views on the policy question. Depends what kind of world you want.
Backing up even further, we might just entertain the reason why we have nuclear families in the first place. And I would say that, well, aside from how prevalent the nuclear family as opposed to an extended kin group is, but why we have males and females having long-term bonds with each other and moving in a direction for the last, really slowly from 6 to 2 million years ago, and then much more quickly since 2 million years ago, a decrease in the difference in the size between males and females. The reason why that's all happening is for males and females to be raising their kids together. So it is on biparental care. Now it's not, I mean, many people in this room have been raised by one parent. I'm not saying that that is impossible, but in a situation of increased social competition in our history, it became a better guarantor of social success to have male and female together taking care of offspring, which leads to monogamy. Because as Joe mentioned, if the more polygynous you are, the higher testosterone you have, the more you're going out and getting new mates. This is from the male perspective. From the female perspective, if you have a male that is only mated to you, you have a partner in this project of rearing the offspring. And so I would say that so many things, concealed ovulation in humans, which basically keeps the male around because he's not just going to come when your butt is red like a mandrill or something like that, and you are ready to bear children. Because sex is no longer just about procreation, it's also about maintaining the pair bond. And that is just as important of a role in human and hominin societies as having babies in the first place. So this is the reason why we have these sorts of things. We don't have this to remind me to eat breakfast in the morning, right? We have this in order to socially enforce monogamy. Why would we want to do that? It's sort of like a gene culture coevolution thing. We are essentially using a cultural surrogate for genetic adaptation to accelerate this move that we've been doing for the last 6 million years towards a culture, a human culture where two individuals are in partnership, at least two individuals, in taking care of offspring rather than just the mother.
I think this is a case where the evolutionary perspective is useful because one thing, pair bond and monogamy isn't the same thing, right? Gorillas have pair bonds and polygyny, right? You're just pair bonded to multiple individuals at the same time. And it also understands why, we have lifetime marriage, but pair bonds don't know that, right? So the emotions and stuff that cause the pair bond, nothing tells them they got to last for 30 years or whatever. So that's where you get a difference between the cultural expectations and the physiology.